What if the people history books called the Sioux were never a single people at all, but the result of centuries of movement, alliance, separation, and change? And what if DNA is not revealing that their story was false, but that the story we were given was far too simple? Before we go any further, remember this. When you hear the word Sioux, you are hearing a name created through layers of history, language, conflict, and outside labeling. If you want to uncover what the evidence actually tells us, stay with this story, because the first surprise is not where the Sioux came from. It is how much the word itself hides. For generations, many Americans were taught a familiar picture. A powerful native people lived on the Great Plains. They rode horses. They hunted buffalo. They fought the U.S. Army. They defended the Black Hills. Famous names like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Red Cloud became symbols of resistance. That story contains real history, but it leaves out something enormous. The people we casually call the Sioux were not simply one giant tribe that appeared on the plains, lived there unchanged for thousands of years, and then suddenly disappeared into reservations. Their history was much more complicated, and DNA is helping scientists understand just how complicated human movement across North America really was. But there is an important warning before we begin. DNA cannot tell us that a living nation is somehow fake. It cannot erase traditions. It cannot decide who has the right to belong to a community. And it cannot replace the history that Native people themselves have preserved. Genes are one piece of evidence. Archaeology is another. Language is another. Oral history is another. And when all of these clues are placed together, something fascinating appears. The Sioux story is not a story of one frozen people. It is a story of movement, a story of adaptation, a story of different communities becoming connected, and eventually, a story of people becoming one of the most powerful forces on the Great Plains. To understand the mystery, we have to go backward, much farther backward than the famous battles of the 19th century. Long before horses thundered across the plains, before the United States existed, before Europeans reached North America, human communities were already moving, separating, meeting, and changing across the continent. The ancestors of indigenous peoples in the Americas have deep roots in populations connected to ancient peoples of Northeast Asia. Modern genetic research has shown that Native American population history was not a simple journey from one place to another. Scientists have found evidence of ancient population movements, long periods of separation, and later mixing. That means there was never a single moment when someone could point to a map and say, here's where the Sioux began. Human history does not work that neatly. Imagine a huge river. At first, the river is one body of water. Then it reaches rocks. It divides. One branch moves east. Another moves south. Another turns north. Thousands of years later, some branches meet again. Others disappear into the landscape. Some mix together. Some remain separate. Population history can work in much the same way. The ancestors of today's native nations moved through North America over enormous stretches of time. Generations passed. Languages changed. Cultures changed. Communities divided. New alliances formed, and eventually groups that had once been separated could become closely connected. This is where the Sioux story becomes especially interesting. The word Sioux is commonly used as a broad label for peoples whose own languages and identities include Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota communities. That distinction matters, because saying the Sioux can make millions of moments of history sound like one event. But Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota communities have their own identities and histories. The term Sioux itself also came through a complicated history of language and colonial contact. So right away, the mystery changes. The question is no longer, where did the Sioux tribe come from? A better question is, how did different communities connected by language, ancestry, culture, and political relationships develop into the nations later grouped together under the name Sioux? And that question takes us toward the heart of the mystery. For a long time, outsiders imagined the Plains tribes as people who had always belonged to the Plains. It is easy to understand why. When people imagine the Lakota of the 19th century, they picture enormous grasslands. They picture buffalo. They picture teepees. They picture horses. They picture warriors crossing the open country. But the world of the Great Plains was not always their world. The Lakota, in particular, went through major changes in where they lived and how they lived. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that Dakota-related peoples were connected to regions farther east before Lakota expansion across the plains. And this is one of the most important parts of the story. The Plains identity that became so famous was not simply inherited unchanged from the distant past. It developed. It evolved. It was built through movement and adaptation. Think about what that means. A people can move into a new environment and still remain themselves. They can adopt new technologies. They can change their economy. They can build new political relationships. They can fight new enemies. They can trade with new neighbors. They can even transform their entire way of life. And yet, through language, family, ceremony, memory, and community, they can continue to understand themselves as the same people. That is not a contradiction. That is human history. And around the Great Lakes and upper Mississippi region, Dakota communities lived in an environment very different from the open plains. They depended on rivers, forests, wetlands, seasonal resources, agriculture, hunting, fishing, and trade. Their world was connected to waterways. One place was especially important, Badot. The word refers to the place where the Minnesota River meets the Mississippi River. For many Dakota people, Badot holds profound cultural and spiritual importance and is connected to their creation traditions. So when someone says, the Sioux came from the Great Plains, that statement can hide a much deeper history. Because for Dakota people, the story of home is connected to places far older than the images created by Hollywood. And then came another transformation. The horse. The arrival and spread of horses across the plains changed indigenous life in ways that are difficult to exaggerate. Horses made movement faster. They changed hunting. They changed warfare. They changed trade. They changed the size of territories people could travel through. They changed relationships between nations. And they helped create the powerful plains cultures that became famous around the world. But here is the part many people miss. The horse did not magically create the Lakota. The Lakota were already there. The horse became a tool that allowed them to transform their power and their way of life. Over time, Lakota communities moved westward and became increasingly connected to the Great Plains. They developed a way of life deeply tied to buffalo. They became highly mobile. They built strong networks. They competed with other nations. They formed alliances, and they expanded their influence. This was not simply a story of people being pushed around by history. It was also a story of indigenous nations making decisions and shaping the future themselves. Some historians describe the Lakota as a powerful force that built a major indigenous political order across parts of the northern plains. That is a very different picture from the old image of Native Americans, simply waiting for Europeans to arrive. And this is where our first major mystery loop begins. If the people later called the Sioux were changing, moving, dividing, and expanding long before the United States became a nation, then what exactly does Sioux identity mean? Is identity hidden inside DNA? Is it hidden inside language? Is it hidden inside geography? Or is it something much larger? Keep that question in mind. Because DNA gives us part of the answer, but not the answer many people expect. If you enjoy stories where history turns out to be much more complicated than the version we were taught, take a moment to share this video with someone who loves history. Sometimes one surprising question is enough to make us look at an entire chapter of the past differently. Now let's talk about DNA. When people hear the phrase DNA reveals the truth, they often imagine a simple test. A scientist takes a sample. The machine produces a result, and suddenly the entire origin of a people is revealed. Real science is not like that. DNA is powerful, but it is not a time machine. Scientists compare genetic patterns among populations. They study ancient remains when they are available and ethically appropriate. They compare ancient DNA with modern DNA. They look for shared ancestry. They examine changes through time, and they combine those results with archaeology, linguistics, and historical evidence. The biggest genetic story is not about one tribe. It is about the entire peopling of the Americas. Modern genetic research strongly supports deep ancestry connecting indigenous peoples of the Americas with ancient populations from Northeast Asia, with a complicated history of movement and separation. But there is a huge difference between saying that Native Americans have deep ancestry connected to ancient populations in Asia, and saying that a modern nation can be reduced to a percentage of DNA. It cannot. Imagine two brothers. They share much of their ancestry. But one becomes a farmer. The other becomes a sailor. Their lives can become completely different. Now imagine their descendants after hundreds of years. Their genes still carry pieces of the same family history, but their cultures may be completely different. That is why DNA cannot replace culture. And it is why the phrase true origins needs to be handled carefully. The ancestors of the people who became Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota were part of a much larger indigenous history. But the nations themselves formed through thousands of years of social development. A DNA test does not create a nation. A DNA test does not erase a nation. And a DNA test cannot tell a person everything about who they are. This matters because there's a popular myth about Native Americans that keeps returning. The myth says indigenous peoples were isolated, unmixed, and unchanged until Europeans arrived. But the archaeological record tells a different story. North America was filled with movement. Trade networks stretched enormous distances. Ideas traveled, objects traveled, people traveled, languages interacted, communities fought, communities married, communities formed alliances, communities broke apart. The continent was never culturally frozen. The Great Plains were not an empty stage waiting for history to begin. They were a living world filled with nations. The people later grouped together as Sioux were part of that changing world. Then came European contact. At first, Europeans saw only fragments. Explorers met one community, traders met another, missionaries recorded another, military officers later wrote reports about still others. Each outsider saw only a small piece. Then those fragments were placed into European categories: tribes, nations, bands, races. These categories often failed to capture indigenous political and cultural systems. And the word Sioux became one of those broad labels that created a problem that still affects how people talk about Native history today. One word can hide many identities. One map can hide centuries of movement. One DNA result can hide generations of family history. And one photograph can make an entire culture look frozen in time. The famous photographs of the Plains Indians helped create a powerful image: feathers, horses, buffalo robes, weapons, teepees, open grassland. But photographs only captured a moment. They did not show the thousands of years that came before. They did not show the decisions families made. They did not show the movement of communities. They did not show childhood. They did not show language being passed from grandparents to children. They did not show winter counts being remembered. They did not show people adapting to new dangers. And they certainly did not show DNA. The deeper story is much more human. Imagine a young person living out generations before the United States existed. They wake before sunrise. They hear people speaking the language of their community. They know the rivers. They know the animals. They know which plants appear in which season. They know the names of places. They know stories told by grandparents. They have no idea that thousands of years later, strangers will argue about where their descendants came from. For that person, ancestry is not a chart. It is family. It is land. It is memory. It is responsibility. And that may be the most important thing DNA cannot measure. A person can carry ancient ancestry in their cells without knowing the names of the people who carried it before them. But a community can preserve names, stories, ceremonies, places, and language across generations. Those are different kinds of evidence. And when they agree, the story becomes powerful. When they disagree, scientists have to slow down. That is why responsible researchers use words like suggests. Not proves everything, not solves history, not reveals a secret race, just suggests. Because human history is rarely a straight line. And there's another surprise. The ancestors of modern indigenous peoples were not simply wandering randomly. Population movement often happened in waves. Communities could remain in one region for long periods. Then climate changed, resources changed, new. Technologies appeared, new alliances formed, pressure from neighboring groups increased, people moved, and when they moved, they carried more than genes. They carried languages, they carried beliefs, they carried skills, they carried memories, they carried names, they carried relationships. That is how a population becomes more than a biological group. It becomes a people. And that distinction helps explain the Sioux story. The history of Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples cannot be reduced to a DNA percentage because their identity was built through relationships, family relationships, community relationships, political relationships, spiritual relationships, relationships with land, and relationships with other nations. That is also why the 19th century cannot be understood simply as Sioux versus America. There were many nations involved. There were alliances. There were conflicts. There were negotiations. There were treaties. There were disagreements within communities. And there were massive pressures created by U.S. expansion. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty is one of the most important moments. The treaty involved the nations historically grouped as Sioux, including Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota communities. It recognized a large territory west of the Missouri River, including the Black Hills. But the agreement would not protect the land forever. Gold was discovered in the Black Hills after a U.S. military expedition in the 1870s. Prospectors entered. The pressure increased. The United States eventually took control of the Black Hills, and the conflict intensified. The famous Battle of the Little Bighorn came in 1876. George Custer and hundreds of U.S. soldiers were killed. The battle became legendary, but the story did not end there. The U.S. government responded with greater military pressure. Armed resistance weakened. Communities faced hunger, disease, displacement, and growing restrictions. Eventually, the old world of the plains was broken apart. The buffalo herds were devastated. Land was taken. Reservations became central to government policy. Children were sent to boarding schools. Languages and traditions came under intense pressure. This part of the story matters because it changes how we understand the word origin. The origin of a people is not just the place where their distant ancestors once lived. It is also the story of how they survived everything that happened afterward. And that survival is where the DNA story becomes unexpectedly emotional. Because when scientists examine ancestry, they are looking backward. But living Native communities are looking both backward and forward. They are not simply descendants of ancient people. They are people living today, speaking, teaching, remembering, rebuilding, protecting their traditions, and deciding what their future should look like. If this part of the story made you rethink what the word origin really means, leave one word in the comments: ancestry. Not because a comment can solve history, but because the word itself carries a question that every family on Earth eventually faces. Where did we come from? Now there's another layer. For years, people searched for a single, original Native American. But that idea is misleading. There was no single frozen Native American culture. The continent contained enormous diversity: different languages, different economies, different religions, different political systems, different environments, different histories. A community living in the Arctic faced a completely different world from one living in the Southwest. A community living along a major river faced different choices from one living on the plains. And the people who became Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota were part of this enormous network. Their history is connected to the wider story of Indigenous North America. That is why the genetic evidence should not be used to create a sensational claim that the Sioux were secretly something completely different. The evidence does not support a simple story like that. Instead, it supports something much more interesting. The people who became the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota were indigenous peoples of North America with deep ancestry reaching far back into the ancient population history of the continent. Their specific histories developed over long periods through movement, separation, contact, and cultural change. And the Plains world that became famous was a later chapter in that much longer story. That is the real twist. The shocking discovery is not that the Sioux were not Native American. It is that the old picture of Native identity was too small. It treated culture as if it were frozen. It treated tribes as if they were sealed containers. It treated geography as if people never moved. And it treated DNA as if it could explain everything. But people are more complicated than genes. Consider language. Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota are connected through the Sioux language family. Language carries clues about relationships between communities. Words can preserve ancient connections even when people move hundreds of miles. A language can reveal that two communities once shared something important. But language also changes. Pronunciation changes. Words disappear. New words appear. Different communities develop their own forms. That is another reminder that identity is alive. It changes while still carrying the past. The same is true of culture. The Lakota world of the 19th century was not identical to the world of their distant ancestors, but that does not make it less authentic. It makes it historical. A culture that survives by adapting is still a culture. In fact, adaptation may be one of the strongest signs of survival. The Plains horse culture itself was an example. People did not simply receive the horse and become someone else. They incorporated it into an existing world. They used it to hunt. They used it to travel. They used it in warfare. They developed new skills around it. They changed their political relationships because of it. The result was something new. Not fake, not artificial. New. That word matters. Because history is full of people who changed while remaining themselves. And the Sioux story is one of those stories. There's also a danger in calling DNA evidence shocking. Science can be exciting without turning human beings into mysteries on a laboratory table. Behind every ancient genetic sample is a person, someone who lived, someone who had family, someone who had a name, someone who belonged somewhere. Modern researchers have become increasingly aware of the ethical issues involved in studying ancient human remains. Native communities have often challenged museums and researchers over the removal, storage, and study of ancestral remains. Repatriation has become an important part of the relationship between museums and Native nations. That changes the scientific conversation. The question is no longer only, what can we learn from this skeleton? It is also, who was this person and who has the right to decide what happens to their remains? That is a deeply human question. And it reminds us that science does not exist outside society. The search for ancient DNA can reveal incredible information. But the people connected to that history deserve respect. This brings us to another mystery. What happens when genetic evidence and traditional knowledge appear to tell different stories? The answer is not automatically that one must be destroyed. They may be answering different questions. Science often asks about biological relationships and population movement. Oral traditions can preserve meaning, place, memory, identity, and relationships. They are not always designed to answer the same question. A creation tradition may explain where a people understand themselves to have emerged spiritually. DNA may describe biological ancestry. Those are not necessarily competing claims. They can exist in different layers of human understanding. This is one reason the title True Origins can be dangerous if taken too literally. There is rarely one single origin story that explains everything. There are biological origins, cultural origins, linguistic origins, political origins, and remembered origins. The Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota histories contain all of these. And once you understand that, the old story begins to fall apart, not because it was completely false, but because it was incomplete. The familiar image of the Sioux as horse-riding buffalo hunters of the plains is real, but it describes a particular historical period. It does not describe the entire ancestry of the people. It is like looking at one photograph of a person at age 40 and claiming that photograph explains their entire life. It cannot. You would miss their childhood. You would miss their grandparents. You would miss their struggles. You would miss the choices that shaped them. You would miss everything that happened before the photograph was taken. The same is true of history. The famous Plains era was one chapter. The story began long before it, and it continued long after it. Today, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota communities remain. That fact alone destroys one of the oldest myths about Native history, the myth that Indigenous peoples belong only to the past. They do not. The descendants of the people who lived through these transformations are still here. They have families, governments, languages, artists, teachers, elders, young people, communities, and living debates about the future. Their history did not stop at Wounded Knee. It did not stop when reservations were created. It did not stop when boarding schools tried to suppress Indigenous languages and cultures. History continued, and that means the DNA story also has to be understood differently. The genes are ancient, but the people are not. They are modern human beings carrying ancient ancestry into a new world. That is true for almost everyone on Earth. Every person alive today is the result of countless generations of movement and survival. Our ancestors migrated, they married, they separated, they fought, they cooperated, they survived droughts, they survived diseases, they crossed rivers, they crossed mountains, they adapted, and eventually they became us. So perhaps the biggest lesson from the Sioux story is not about the Sioux alone. It is about how badly humans want history to be simple. We like clean lines, we like beginnings, we like endings, we like labels. We want to say this group came from here, that group came from there, this culture started on this date, that people never moved. But real history is messy. Real history has branches, it has loops, it has dead ends, it has unexpected meetings, and it has people changing while carrying pieces of the past with them. That is exactly what makes it fascinating. The Sioux were never simply one image. They were never just the warriors of old photographs. They were never just buffalo hunters. They were never just characters in a Western movie. And they should never be reduced to DNA. They were and are communities with complex histories. The evidence suggests deep Indigenous ancestry reaching far back into the ancient population history of the Americas. Their more specific histories developed through long periods of movement and cultural change. Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota communities share important linguistic and historical connections while maintaining distinct identities, and the Lakota transformation into a powerful plains people was a major historical development, not the beginning of their existence. That distinction changes everything, because now the story becomes bigger. Instead of asking, were the Sioux really who we thought they were, we can ask a better question. Why did we ever think we could understand an entire people from one picture? Why did we assume a culture had to remain unchanged to be authentic? Why did we imagine that movement somehow made identity less real? And why do we sometimes treat DNA as if it has the power to tell us who a person truly is? The answer may say more about modern society than it does about ancient America. We have become fascinated with ancestry tests. Millions of people want to know where their genes came from. A percentage appears on a screen and suddenly people feel they have discovered something about themselves. But ancestry is not only percentages. Imagine finding out that you share DNA with people from a place your family has never heard of. Well, would that automatically make you part of that culture? Of course not. You could share ancestry without sharing language, without sharing traditions, without sharing family ties, without belonging to the community. DNA can tell you something important, but it cannot tell you everything that matters. And that may be the greatest lesson hidden inside this entire mystery. Human identity is bigger than biology. A people can move and remain a people. A culture can change and remain a culture. A language can evolve and still carry ancient memory. A community can suffer enormous losses and still survive. And a nation can be described incorrectly by outsiders for centuries and still know who it is. So when we look at the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota today, we should not see a mystery waiting for scientists to solve. We should see a living history, a history that science can help illuminate, a history that archaeology can help trace, a history that language can help explain, a history that oral traditions continue to preserve, and a history that belongs to living people, not just museums and textbooks. The real revelation of DNA is therefore not that the Sioux were secretly something else. It is that ancestry is deeper and more complicated than the simple labels we inherited. The old story gave us a picture. Science gives us more layers. History gives us more layers, and the voices of Native communities give us more layers still. Put them together and the picture changes. You begin to see people moving across landscapes. You see communities separating and reconnecting. You see languages carrying old relationships. You see new technologies transforming old ways of life. You see horses changing the plains. You see buffalo becoming central to an entire economy and culture. You see nations competing and cooperating. You see treaties being signed. You see promises being broken. You see land being taken. You see families fighting to preserve their identity. And finally, you see something that DNA alone could never reveal. You see survival. That may be the most powerful word in this entire story, survival. Not because everything stayed the same, but because everything changed. The world changed. The land changed. Technology changed. Political power changed. Borders changed. Yet, people continued. That is why the deepest truth about the Sioux is not hidden inside a laboratory. It is hidden inside the combination of everything. Genes, language, land, memory, family, history, and identity. So, the next time you see an old photograph of a Lakota warrior standing beneath an enormous sky, remember something. You're not looking at the beginning of a people. You're looking at one moment in a story that began thousands of years earlier. And when you see a modern Dakota or Lakota family today, remember something else. You're not looking at the end of that story. You're looking at the continuation of it. The past is not gone. It is carried. Sometimes in DNA, sometimes in language, sometimes in a place, sometimes in a story told by an elder, and sometimes in a child who learns an old word from a grandparent and carries it into the future. That is the part no DNA test can ever fully measure. The human ability to remember, the human ability to adapt, and the human ability to survive. Perhaps that is the real shock. The Sioux were not never who we thought. We were simply never taught the whole story. And once you see the story as a long river instead of a single photograph, everything changes. The river began long before the United States. It flowed through generations. It divided. It joined again. It changed direction. It carried people into new worlds. It survived storms. And it is still flowing. The names may change. The landscape may change. The world may change. But the story continues. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of Ancestry itself. We are all carrying worlds inside us that we never personally witnessed. We carry the choices of people who lived before us. We carry their migrations, their losses, their courage, their mistakes, their survival. The people we become will carry something of us into a future we will never see. So the next time someone tells you that history is simple, remember the Sioux. Remember that a people can move without disappearing. They can change without becoming less real. They can survive without remaining frozen in the past. And sometimes the most shocking truth revealed by science is not that the story was a lie. It is that the truth was always much bigger than the story.